lower versus higher consciousness when it comes to preferences and attachments. The human experience gives way for preference. At every moment, we are establishing preferences, desires, likes, and dislikes. However, there is a difference between having a preference, like, dislike, or desire that holds an emotional attachment versus a preference, like, dislike, or desire for the pure experience of it. Do you feel how they differ? Having a preference due to an attachment, especially an emotional attachment, versus having a preference for the pure experience of it. For example, let's take something simple like vanilla ice cream. Here's one example of a preference with an attachment. I really dislike vanilla ice cream. It's so boring. It reminds me of every time I would get ice cream as a kid and I would always want something else, but my parents would only get me vanilla. Versus, this is an example of a preference without an attachment. I dislike vanilla, but it was fun while it lasted. I don't necessarily focus on the fact that I dislike vanilla because I'm so much more intrigued by the other flavor profiles out there for ice cream. Anything that you can think of, there's a flavor for it, and I'm excited to try them all. Here's another example of a preference with an emotional attachment. I dislike the rain. It makes me so depressed. When it's cloudy outside, all I want to do is lay in bed. I don't want to do anything. Versus this example without an attachment. I dislike the rain. Yes, it may make me a bit depressed, but that's only because I enjoy the sunshine so much. I will allow the rain to pull out my deeper emotions to the surface. It gives me time, reason, and space to sit with these deep emotions, especially when I'm feeling down or sad. I can lay in bed and not feel bad about it because the rain makes me want to sleep in, and I do enjoy my sleep. I also know that the earth thrives on water and the rain is a blessing to the earth. Everything is so green and lush the next day after a rain, and it reminds me of the abundance that the earth holds. I am part of that abundance too, so I will also have gratitude for the rain because I know that the sunshine will eventually come out, and when it does, I will appreciate it so much more. Do you feel the difference in between these preferences with attachments and preferences without attachments? Especially when it comes to emotional attachments. Preferences with emotional attachments hold a lot of weight and density, while preferences without attachments, without emotional attachments, hold buoyancy or lightness that allows almost a neutrality to flow through the experience to make it pure, simple experience of the preference without the density or weight of the emotional attachment. This is important to know because even if you hold a preference, you do not need to hold it in a space of judgment or limitation. Your openness of a preference without attachment or judgment allows you to see all sides of the experience as pure experience. It allows you to explore the preference for the full experience while still honoring how you want to feel through that experience. When you hold a preference with attachment and with judgment, it hones in into a specific part of that experience where the attachment and the judgment is, and allows you to experience the preference through the lens of the attachment and judgment only. When you let go of the attachment and judgment, it opens up the experience of the preference for you to experience the fullness of the preference from all sides. Even if you were to receive something different from your preference, the lightness, the openness, the flexibility, and similar neutrality energy that you hold with your preference in an open state, not attached and not in judgment, makes it so that you can easily adapt to changes or differences within the preference because you're always able to see all sides from the start. A preference that holds strong weight with attachment or with a judgment again does not allow much space to witness all sides. So therefore, no matter what the preference is, it will always hold a limiting factor, which is that your preference with the blinders of the attachment or the judgment is above all else, and if what you get does not align with your preference, then you will have an emotional reaction simply because the attachments that you have to your preference hold emotional weight. Meaning that if you have a preference that holds emotional attachment or judgment, then you are more inclined to be less flexible when it comes to anything outside of that preference. Now, it's important to note that preference is not the same thing as taking sides. This is not about taking sides. The overall energy of taking sides is diluted into a lower state of consciousness simply because taking sides is predominantly founded upon there being a right and a wrong, a good and a bad, etc. However, with that being said, lower states of consciousness are essential for the integration of preferences. Why? Because you are closer to the experience than you are in observation of it, or in observation to it. Think of it as a field of depth or height. Lower states of consciousness are closer to the ground. You can see, touch, taste, feel, hear, smell on closer levels to the ground than you can through higher levels away from the ground. You take in more detail, which builds and hones your preferences. For example, you can prefer the mountains over the desert because the weather is cooler and you prefer the animals and trees of the mountains rather than the insects and the sand of the desert. But the only way that you know this is your close proximity to the ground and your closer proximity to experiencing what the details of the mountains and the desert are. Your close proximity to the ground is engaging, it's more engaging, but at the same time, it is also what builds our attachments to the very things that we are connecting to. So being closer to the ground, lower consciousness, gives us closer proximity to experience things on a more detailed level so that we can gain preferences and desires, likes and dislikes. But while we're also in the trenches of the proximity to the ground, cultivating our preferences, likes, dislikes, and desires, our closeness to the ground also is the thing that creates and builds our attachments to the things on the ground. Higher states of consciousness is like opening the lens for a wider perspective and view of the ground. You are higher than the clouds with a larger and wider field of depth, which activates observation more than direct experience. And this is where the distance between right and wrong or good and bad begin to blend together because it's not as black and white as it appears when you are closer in proximity to it. Holding a higher state of consciousness enables a wider perspective and the ability to see and observe more things all at once. You're able to see all sides, not just the one side of the experience that you're in. Lower states of consciousness is necessary for building desire, preference, likes and dislikes due to contrast through direct experience. Integrating a higher state of consciousness through a lower state of consciousness experience, which is what we're doing right now, allows us to hold higher knowledge, greater perspective, and observation within a duality experience. This is necessary for shifting out of lower states of consciousness because it implements solutions and desires that integrate a sense of wholeness and bigger picture into lower states of experiences that are held in separation and disconnection. But we also have to understand that lower states of consciousness serve higher states of consciousness in very grand ways, especially through the movement out of lower and into higher states of consciousness, that transition. What occurs is a filtering of preferences from attachment to non-attachment. When you hold a desire, or even a like or a dislike or a preference, the difference between holding the desire, like, dislike, or preference as purely experiential versus an attachment to an outcome or an emotion is what makes a huge difference in the experience of the desire, preference, like, or dislike. There becomes less stress, less expectation, less suffering as you release those emotional attachments to the preference, desire, like or dislike. This is why ascension during this specific time is so profound. We are taking all of our preferences, likes and dislikes and desires from our experiences within a lower consciousness field closer to the ground, and we're taking all of that into higher states of consciousness. And through that transition, we're filtering all of our preferences, likes, dislikes, and desires through a filter of attachment to non-attachment. What this does is it brings the intimate knowledge of pure experience, especially when it comes to contrast, into a higher conscious mind to birth new experiences based on not only preference, desires, likes, and dislikes, but higher consciousness wisdom that both observes and unites. It allows us to experience our preferences, likes, dislikes, and desires through the realm of non-attachment so that we are in the pure experience of it. Think of higher states of consciousness as similar to understanding what ice cream is, the intricacies and all things connected to it, but never fully having the experience of tasting it. Lower states of consciousness allows us to taste it and then build preference, saying I like chocolate more than vanilla, or I prefer strawberry over chocolate, for example. Moving from a lower consciousness into a higher consciousness is about having the experience of tasting ice cream, having that experience, knowing what it tastes like, building a preference through the experience, I like strawberry over vanilla, and then multiplying it or expanding that experience and preference through the depth and connectivity of a higher consciousness. The possibilities and inspiration to create further and even more and build upon that preference become endless, and movement into desirable directions expands as far as higher consciousness is able to observe the bigger picture. So we have to also understand that higher consciousness is constantly moving into an even higher state of consciousness, into an even higher level and higher level and higher level. And so we are just taking one step up and almost redirecting where that ground state is. So even if we move into a higher state of consciousness, we're still on the ground level to an even higher state of consciousness, if that makes sense, where we do this all over again in order to continue to evolve and expand into bigger and bigger pictures. But what is so profound at this time that's been coming through is the shift from attachment to non-attachment when it comes to our preferences, likes, dislikes, and desires. The lower field of consciousness allowed us to sift and sort and have all of those things and have our preferences based upon those experiences of duality and contrast. However, within duality and contrast in lower states of consciousness, our ability to have preferences often came with attachment, especially emotional attachments. This huge shift, this ascension, this shift into new earth is about taking all of those preferences, releasing our attachments to it so that we can now experience those preferences, likes, dislikes, and desires from this new state of being, embodying our higher self while experiencing those preferences, likes, dislikes, and desires, and having them for the pure experience of it from this new state of being. And that is almost a new thing to discover when it comes to our preferences, likes, dislikes, and desires.